piani per il futuro di nuovi lotti di studio. Come sapete, dopo la scoperta nel 1891 del cachette di Bab el-Gasus, ci fu una prima suddivisione in 17 lotti che portarono le collezioni per tutta Europa, poi ci furono delle suddivisioni, per cui adesso sono circa 40 istituzioni che contengono sarcofagi che appartengono a quest'epoca. Quindi non rubo più tempo al Professor Sousa, so now I switch to English. I do apologize that I've introduced you in Italian, but as I said, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you here, and we are really willing to listen from your voice what is the development of the so-called yellow coffins, both from a structural point of view, from an iconographical point of view, and to hear about the variety of themes that are in these wonderful coffins. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. for your kind words of appreciation. Thank you for your invitation to be here today, sharing with you the results of my research on yellow coffins. Yellow coffins are puzzling objects. When we look at them and we see the variety of the decoration that they have and the profusion of elements that they display, it is almost unlikely that these objects were being crafted during a period of enormous crisis. And from the historical point of view, they were being crafted in Thebes during the 21st dynasty, which is a period of an enormous social unrest and economical crisis. In many ways, the pharaonic system, from the economical point of view, was collapsing. And yet, we find these materials, which, when we look at them, we can hardly find any trace of such a situation of unrest. So there is, to begin with, yellow coffins are an amazing corpus, documental corpus, and they offer enormous sources for our research. And this situation is so puzzling as we find here in this documental corpus, perhaps, one of the most complex objects ever created in the ancient world. And this is not just about one coffin, this is about an enormous series of objects that were crafted in such a way that, in fact, they show a very atypical moment in the ancient world, and in this particular moment, many things were happening, not only in Egypt, but in the old Mediterranean. So they are puzzling in this contrast. This documental corpus has been dealt with by a number of scholars, not so much as they should be, and they are an amazing source of information for the historical point of view, from the archaeological point of view, for the economical and sociological studies. But my perspective here today is to present you an approach to these objects from the semiological point of view. That is, to study these objects as a system of signs and symbols. And this is a particularly complex task, as you just having a glimpse of these objects, you look at an enormous, dense system of decoration, and it took me some time and some years, to start to understand, at least to build a system to understand this semiological system. So, what I will bring you today are the results of the first stage of this work. These objects are these burial assemblages are composed by a coffin, mummy covers, and the coffin has a lid and a case. And this is far too much information to deal with. And what I will bring here today is the results relating to the decorative scheme of the lid alone. So, and for this reason, I will avoid to have to jump into conclusions in the end of this presentation. I will present you my methods, the methods that I've developed, and the results that I achieved with this method, knowing that this is an ongoing process and it is still at the beginning. But the first thing that I would like to share with you is that I think any scholar who experienced that with any kind of documental corpus, but it happened to me with these materials, the same thing that I heard about Howard Carter when for the first time he looked into the tomb of Tutankhamun. I see wonderful things, and indeed, this an enormous documental corpus where we do see wonderful things. So, starting with this survey, I would like to make a quick introduction about the anthropoid coffins. Anthropoid coffins arrived lately in the archaeological records in Egypt. But soon enough, they outnumber the other categories of body containers. And during time, they adopted different forms and layouts. In each category of anthropoid coffins, the study of symbolism and meaning reveals an interesting evolution which is deeply rooted always in the funerary mask, in the symbolism of the funerary mask. And in this particular object, the funerary mask, the deceased is depicted either as a Sa, that is a mummiform god, or as a Ba. So when we see an anthropoid coffin, usually we assume that the anthropoid coffin has a mummiform image, but indeed it can have several types of associations. One of them is as a bird, as a Ba. But when we look at the pictorial density of the yellow coffins, it is clear that we are dealing with a phenomenon of a distinct nature, making any inquiry on meaning an overwhelming jigsaw puzzle. And in my point of view, this has two main reasons. The first has to do with complexity. The profusion and quantity of details makes the perception of the formal layout difficult to understand. In practical terms, when we face a certain composition, how can we cope with the overwhelming abundance of details? And even simple things such as distinguishing the main features from the secondary ones can be a difficult task to address. The other difficulty is the dynamic nature of coffin decoration. This means that yellow coffins may display enormous discrepancies in terms of complexity, making the perception of its meaning very difficult to grasp. All these variations are meaningful at all? Or these variations are just the result of meaningless additions of motifs? When combined, complexity and the evolving nature of coffin decoration presents serious challenges, even in simple tasks, such as the plain formal description of objects. When I faced the challenge of writing a catalogue on the coffins from the 8th lot of el-Gasus, I realized that usual methods of description would hardly meet the complexity of these objects, as they implicitly assumed identification of the coffin with a statue or even just with a mere stele. I have to say that when we built a catalogue, the usual systems methods that we use suppose the identification of an object with a simple description as a front or side and back view. And the coffin challenges this model. Yellow coffins does make us wonder around apparently unnecessary questions, such as what kind of thing a coffin is. We all assume that we know what a coffin is. It should be a body container used to transport the corpse and to perform funerary rituals. But that would be enough. This question was dealt with by Runa Newhart in a quiet, illuminating way in his study of Middle Kingdom coffin semiology. And for the yellow coffins, dealing with complicity and with the ever-changing nature of coffin decoration, this would require a specific conceptual frameworks. I found in the concept of architectonization put forward by René van Walsum the most useful conceptual framework to understand the role of complexity in coffin decoration. In other words, should we dare to consider yellow coffins as buildings? And if the answer is affirmative, what would be the methodological implications of such approach? According to this view, the coffin is seen as a place, and as such, it is organized according to a topography of its own, displaying different areas or sections. The advantage of adopting such methodology is to study each section in comparative terms, and seriation of a large sample of objects is thus required in order to understand the organization and significance of a particular composition. Regarding the evolving nature of coffin decoration, I borrowed from natural sciences the concept of a genealogical line. As scientists, our analytical minds deal with diversity with a taxonomical approach. Botanists and zoologists had long faced this challenge, and to deal with it, they looked for features that ruled the evolution of species. Again, in practical terms, genealogy requires that when we study an object, we should see it as a momentum in a long evolutionary line. This approach clearly defines the key features that rule evolution and diversity. Certainly, absolute dating is an unsolved problem in this corpus of documents, but relative dating provides a fairly satisfying reference, and in this particular respect, I adopt the usual division and very relative division in three main sub-periods: the first half of the dynasty, the middle, and the late 21st dynasty. The method that I use to describe the coffins from the Geographical Society of Lisbon, it is grounded on these two main concepts, architectonization and genealogy. With the first, we grasp the formal layout of coffin decoration, and with the second, we address the question of evolution and meaning. I will start by discussing the topography of yellow coffins, and then I will examine its genealogy, looking for clues that help us to shed light on its meaning. So, if the yellow coffins belong to a category of its own, what really defines the yellow type? Andrzej Niewicki is the author of an important and ongoing research on coffin decoration from this period. He was the first to create the inventory of this wide documental corpus, and he was the first to recognize the evolving nature of the yellow type. In order to cope with diversity, Andrzej Niwiński put forward the first comprehensive typology on the holotype. Based on the general layout of the whole lid, the author established 5 main categories. My approach to this question is slightly different in a number of aspects. Some of them are related with the definition of the holotype itself. Is the color of the background enough to define this type? If we look at the documental corpus, coffins with yellow background are detected as early as the 18th dynasty. And this one in particular is often mentioned as the first object known belonging to the holotype. And I disagree strongly with this. To my point of view, an object like this consists in a more affordable version of the gilded objects designed after the layout of the black type. So there is nothing here different from the former model of anthropoid coffins in use, which is the black type. And this particular model, the black type, usually makes use of a winged deity on the lid and the 4 sons of Horus and Thoth on the sides. Isis and Nephthys here are depicted on the underside of the footboard and on the crown of the head. This is a typical layout of the black type. This scheme is drawn chiefly from the vignette of chapter 151 of the Book of the Dead, showing these divinities grouped around the mummy using the same positions occupied in the coffins. Regarding strictly the lid, when we look at the layout of the coffins from previous periods, it is clear the enormous gap between the holotype and the remaining ones. Despite the continuum with the former models of anthropoid coffins, in a way the holotype evolves from a strong break with the established tradition of coffin decoration. To my point of view, the key to understand this rupture is found in perhaps the most defining object of the holotype, the mummy cover. The mummy cover resulted from fusing 2 objects previously used with distinct magical roles. The funerary mask, which would be deriving here, and the mummy board, which embraced and protected the mummy. So the mummy cover is the result of the fusion of these 2 objects, this plank here and the funerary mask. During the Ramesside period, the layout of these objects changed considerably. The mask depicted the deceased as a living, wearing festive wigs and garments, while the mummy board included for the first time the depiction of the deceased himself in the iconographic program of the coffin. We see it here now escorting the gods, which traditional were depicted in these objects. And we see here fragments of this mummy board featuring the deceased himself. So both changes result from the previous use of mummy boards featuring the deceased as a living. The meaning of these objects is worthy to explore and reveal important clues to understand the holotype. In the tomb of Sennacherib, when we compare this life-sized plank with the tomb paintings, it is clear that both settings depict Sennacherib as a deity among gods and not as a living. The use of these funerary boards triggered a phenomenon that would change completely the evolution of coffin decoration. The use of the life-sized images of the deceased in festive garments was just the first step towards the deification of the deceased. Until that moment, only divine images were included in coffin decoration. But from then on, as the deceased achieved this divine status, he would also be included in the repertoire of coffin decoration. This is seen in the coffin of Senegem itself, where for the first time the deceased is included in the decorative program of the lead. And this assimilation triggered the massive download of iconographic repertoire from the tomb to the coffin decoration. The sharp contrast between the parsimonious coffin set of Senegem and those of his wife and son, both heavily decorated with a variety of scenes, fully shows how quick this assimilation took place. The nesting principle that united tomb, funerary equipment, and mummy transformed the lead and assimilated it with the layout of the ceiling of the burial chamber. Both the ceiling of the burial chamber and the lead were now designed as an heavenly gate. This process triggered an active exploration of the new possibilities offered by these new resources in coffin decoration. And these experimentations are typical of what I call the proto-yellow type. And I really find hard to establish a continuum between this proto-yellow type with the strict yellow type that we will be defined later on. Coffins from this category display a highly unstable scheme, combining the traditional layout of the black type with the new motifs. That's why, unlike the typology of Andrzej Niwiński, I avoid to include them in the yellow corpus from a strict point of view. The creation of the mummy cover attests for the first time the stabilization of this process. So when the mummy cover is fully established and the two objects previously used are fused in a single one, from then on we witness to a stabilization of the scheme into this new version of the yellow type. We did a new decorative scheme emerge, celebrating the divine status of the deceased as a deity among gods, interacting with them and performing rituals. This scheme truly depicted the hereafter as a celebration. This festive and revolutionary vision of the afterlife explains the success of this new type of coffin and the pivotal role it performed in assuring social regulation in times of social and economic crisis. So, what I found most striking in yellow type was the way this semantics of celebration was translated from the formal point of view in the creation of several areas or places forming what we can call a topography. In my opinion, the originality of the yellow type lies exactly on this very well-defined topography. As opposed to the other types of coffins, which were conceived as a whole piece, the scheme of the yellow type is now composed of autonomous sections, each one of them designed independently from each other. The lead, in particular, was arranged in 5 distinct sections, each one ruled by a particular set of key features. The result is the following topography composed with an headboard, an upper section, which is delimited by the contour of the forearms and floral colors, the central panel, which is a very sophisticated composition involving 2 or more horizontal registers, a lower section displaying a panel composed of 2 or 3 vertical partitions, and the footboard, usually with the vignettes depicted in the reverse direction. This scheme is the backbone of the yellow type, and it defines it more distinctly than other isolated features, such as the use of varnish or the color of the background itself, which in fact can be black or white. The ever-changing nature of yellow coffins push this scheme into its very limits. When we study and describe these objects, how can we deal with such levels of diversity? How can we integrate and understand the changing nature of the yellow type? To cope with this problem, I found very useful, as I said from the beginning, establishing typologies for each section, rather than to the overall object itself. We will here discuss the typology of the upper section, the central panel, and the lower section. From the formal point of view, the layout of the upper section is largely shaped by two conflicting elements, the forearms and the floral color. In the basic scheme, the forearms are unrealistic depicted over the funerary floral color, still preserving the depiction of the deceased as a living. In the classical scheme, the forearms are partially hidden under the floral color. And in the complex scheme, the forearms completely disappear and the floral color most of the times extends itself towards the abdomen. But noticing this, are these changes meaningful? Well, not only I think the answer to this question is affirmative, as the reading of the symbols reveals totally unexpected views of the role performed by the coffin. In the basic scheme, the deceased is depicted as a justified deity with his arms free from the wrappings and his head gleaming with light and the chest adorned with pectorals and amulets. The representations evolve gradually from the skin itself, and this is very important. It's frequently overlooked. The yellow background should be seen as having the same color of the skin, and we should not forget that some of these depictions are depicted over the skin of the deceased. So, some of these examples of such depictions are to be found in the forearms, others on the chest, or even on the hands. Often seen as a symptom of the horror vacui that drove coffin decorators to fill in any available space, some of these signs might have a more precise reading. Actually, there is a strong possibility that these features may in fact depict ritual tattoos. Evidence of tattoos with similar motifs has been recently documented by Austin and Gobel in mummies dating from the Ramesside period, to whom I thank the way they generously shared with me the results of their research. During the theocratic state of Amun, a phenomenon like this must certainly increase, and it is likely that more evidence may be found of tattoos on mummies from the 21st dynasty. The iconographic repertoire of this section includes, in fact, other evidence of signs that were found in the tattoos of this particular mummy. We shall compare the composition here, depicted over the chest of the deceased, with this composition here. The iconographic repertoire of this section includes central markers, normally pectorals, like these, and necklaces. Some of them usually featuring a sacred scarab. In this one from Turin, we also see an heart amulet depicted here, which is an Osirian symbol of wisdom that is used as a sign of justification. As to the central panel, it evolved also in three main stages. In the basic scheme, the central panel displays two registers. One features the winged goddess, and the other is composed of a symmetrical register. In the classical scheme, the composition presents three registers, one with the winged goddess and two others featuring symmetrical registers. And in the complex scheme, the composition features more than 3 registers. So, what this composition tells us about symbolism? In the basic scheme, the solar significance of the composition is clear, depicting the rebirth of the sun god under the protection of Nut, the heavenly mother goddess. Most of these compositions literally depict the sky here, the heavenly realm of Nut. In the first register, the solar symbol is often depicted in the form of a pectoral, sometimes shaped as an house, or a solar bark, or even a scarab. And it is quite a possibility that they allude to the objects that were used in the protection of the mummy, and were indeed found in the number of mummies. The central motive, which has solar significance, is soon flanked by the enthroned Osiris, and from then on, we witness to the progressive Osirification of the scene. In the classical scheme, the association with the sky is blurred, and the identification with Osirian Duat is favored instead. The panel now alludes to the mysterious solar Osirian union that takes place in the secrecy of the burial chamber, a subject much celebrated in yellow coffins, as suggested by Andrzej Niwiński. These compositions are important for another reason, as they introduce for the first time the so-called space fillers, featuring vultures, cobras, and Chechid shrines. These motifs began to be depicted inside the case, but with the classical scheme they migrated towards the exterior of the coffin itself, and they are depicted literally everywhere. These liminal elements, as I call them, are fluid symbols, some kind of semiotic blood, uniting and nurturing the coffin with the sacredness of the duat. The importance of these motifs was such that the main motifs had to be reduced in order to make room for them. So it's misleading when we see the sizes of the motifs in a particular composition, and it's misleading to think that a small motif is less important than the main motifs. And only seriating these compositions, we can realize that after all, the importance of these small motifs was such that it led to the it was needed to reduce the size of the main registers. Well, certainly not by hazard, the overall arrangement of these scenes reminds the layout of the Ramesside royal sarcophagi. And what to say about these compositions like these? It's an astonishing panel with an increasing, several registers of profuse decoration. And in some of them, the central marker is allusive to the solar Osirian synthesis, that is the heart and the sun disk, which again here figure as standing for the solar Osirian union. But what to say about the other elements? The other elements feature certainly the old motifs of the enthroned Osiris, but also feature new motifs, such as the encounter, the meeting of the deities. So they embrace and they cherish each other, and these kind of compositions are to be found mainly in temple decoration. It's not even in tomb decoration. So And this suggests the identification of the coffin with a sacred precinct. As to the layout of the lower section, it presents a similar evolution in 3 stages. In the basic scheme, the lower section displays 2 vertical partitions, with the main deities centrifugally oriented. In the classical scheme, the lower section is divided in 3 vertical partitions. And in the complex scheme, the tripartite arrangement remains, but the number of the registers is heavily reduced or completely removed. Again, relating to the symbolism of these compositions, in the basic scheme, the lateral partitions include ritual scenes depicting a variety of deities, including the avian form of Tassocaris and the sacred ram of Amun-Re, here. The resulting composition suggests the layout of a sacred gate with a lintel, door jumps, and doors. This resemblance is even more striking if we look at the layout of the few sacred doors that we know of, such as this one found in Deir el-Bahari, featuring the officiant of the cult centripetally oriented and the deity, which here was erased, here, facing outwards, so adopting exactly the same layout that we see here. With the classical scheme, the iconographic variety is reduced, and from then on, only mummiform gods of the underworld are included. In each register, a solo shrine is depicted in frontal view, here. And this solo shrine is flanked by deities in the side views. Altogether, these juxtaposed views suggest the passing of the sun through the sacred gates of the Duat, with Osirian gods protecting this passage. In the complex scheme, the lower section is sometimes omitted. In these cases, the central panel extends its transversal composition towards the footboard. The layout formed by the succession of winged deities reminds the decoration of the ceilings from the temple's central axis, a feature which is usual in royal funerary temples, again suggesting the identification of the lead with the imaginary of the sun journey through the netherworld. It is interesting to point out that the pace of evolution between the several sections is slightly similar, and for that reason, we can speak of different stages of evolution, with the layout of the different sections designed with roughly the same levels of complexity. Let us see in the collection of the museum here, how can we detect these stages? These objects that figure here are entirely designed according to the basic scheme, with displaying the upper section with 4 arms, the central panel with 2 registers, and the lower section featuring 2 vertical partitions. These objects are clearly dating from the first half of the dynasty, if not before, and they preserve the softness and tenderness of the Ramesside style. So these changes are also consistent with differences in style. These ones are designed with the classical scheme, and now the floral color hides most of the forearms. The central panel displays 3 registers, and the lower section features 3 vertical partitions. The style is schematic, miniaturistic, and liminal elements, or space fillers, are abundantly depicted. These coffins should be dated around the middle of the dynasty. As to the other ones, they display the complex scheme, with an increasingly larger floral color, and the central panel featuring 3 or more registers, and in some cases, it fully covers the lead here and here, until the footboard. The style of these objects is heavily sketchy. With this oversimplified overview, one gets the impression of a high degree of standardization. And yet, despite the fact that, despite that, every object is truly unique. This was achieved by using methods of composition that assured that each single object would be unique. This search for uniqueness inevitably led to an increasing complexification of the scheme. Let us see some examples taken from the collection again. And we will see here, from these different objects, how the one single section was changed and evolved over time, always observing the general rules that rule the composition, but at the same time being different and distinct from all the others. We start with this one. We see a basic panel with the basic scheme, and we see here the central motif inside the naos, which is often the case. But we see an interesting thing. We already find here lateral blocks facing outside, and here the composition of these blocks is very different. They display a sphinx here, which is really rare, and here a ram god, which can be found more easily. Moving to a composition with the classical scheme, we find here the most simple structure with the solar symbols and with the winged goddess all around. So it is a very heavily solarized composition when compared, for example, with this one, already displaying the Osirian gods flanking the central element and keeping the winged goddess at the side. We see, it is interesting to see these two objects belong to the same burial assemblage. The mummy cover is usually a simplified version of the decoration of the lid because of it's smaller. And at the lid we find a more complex version of this same scheme, and the complexification is achieved by adding details. In this case, by adding scrines to the composition and secondary motifs which are just added to the main scheme. Moving again, we see here a highly standardized style composition. You see that it is heavily sketchy. The details are almost blurred, but yet they preserve the most fundamental elements. And here, this is a very interesting piece to comment. Is one piece that Cara has already pointed out how interesting it is, because it's clearly a situation of a recycled object from a Ramesside burial assemblage, displaying the deceased in festive garments, and it was recycled very late. It is interesting to see that this operation, this new decorative transformation has been carried out very lately, already featuring the complex scheme with a very standardized style, and yet I think this appropriation was not was so interestingly achieved that the fact that the object was contrastingly different was appreciated in order to notoriously display the uniqueness of this object. So the scheme itself, it obeys to a particular type of lid from this period, but the fact that it has a very contrasting structure, the arms are there, so they are not possible to erase, as it is the rule in this period. And so they are integrated and they are decorated as they were decorated in the beginning of the dynasty. And yet we are facing a very late object. So in many ways this object is different. And the fact that it is recycled, it only adds value, I think, to the object as it was perceived in antiquity. So when we see the evolution detected on the leads, it is clear that the weight of each section in the overall composition of the lead changed considerably with time. In the basic scheme, the lower section is the largest. It's more than half of the old object. While in the complex scheme, the central panel and the upper sections play a more important role in the global economy of the decoration. Here it is clearly predominant, and here it is even more predominant. Once again, we should ask ourselves, do these changes relate with differences in the understanding of the symbolism of the object? And again, I think the answer to this question is affirmative. In the basic scheme, the depiction of the deceased as a living god is consistent with the paramount role of the lower section, which is entirely depicted to illustrate the contact of the deceased with the deities of the underworld. The design of the central panel and the lower section suggests the layout of the sacred door, from where the deceased literally emerges in the threshold of the duat. In the classical scheme, the central panel plays a bolder role, depicting the duat itself, where the most revered mystery of the union of the sun god with Re takes place. This phenomenon witnessed to the Osirification of the coffin, with the layout of the central panel and the lower section, now alluding to the journey of the sun in the netherworld and into the imaginary of the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings. The deceased is now depicted as a mummiform deity, resting in the underworld and participating in the solar Osirian mystery. The complex scheme takes this process even further away. With strong funerary meaning, the garlands and floral colors alludes to the lethargic state of the deceased as a chthonic god, a feature which became even stronger with the introduction of the mummy braces during the late 21st dynasty. The coffin now fully alludes to an Osirian crypt where the deceased is fully acclaimed as a chthonic god. Our genealogical method thus reveals the increasing Osirification of the coffin during the 21st dynasty. Such Osirification is consistent with the understanding of the coffin not exactly as a tomb, but as a sacred place. The paramount role played by the mummy cover is related to its close association with the body itself, which is, of course, the core of the burial assemblage. The coffin is no longer a transitional object, a medium assuring the link between the mummy, the burial chamber, and the beyond. The coffin set is now fully conceived as a self-sufficient magical enclosure, where the holiness and the sacredness of the duat is held within. In this context, the mummy lies at the core of the burial assemblage and resumes it in a way never achieved before. This is perhaps better understood in the pictorial tradition of tomb decoration and funerary papyri. It has long been recognized that during the 18th dynasty, the depiction of the anthropoid coffin stands for the representation of the mummy, with the latter hidden inside the body container. The layout of the coffin depicted in these scenes replicates the model in use during this period, the black type. Decorators even include typical features of these objects, such as the gilded bands, here, or the Sons of Horus. Later on, in the Ramesside period, nested assemblages are suggested by the depiction of two coffins partially or almost completely juxtaposed. During this period, the depiction of the deceased no longer follows the design of the anthropoid coffin in use. In fact, The holotype is no longer depicted in tomb decoration, nor in the funerary papyri. Instead, the deceased is fully depicted as a mummy, wrapped in white bandages and adorned with a mask and a floral collar. This scheme can be seen in the tomb of Sennacherib, thus without any correspondence with the layout of the coffins found in the tomb. Moreover, this trend persists in the 21st dynasty. Funerary papyri observed the same conventions, suggesting that for the first time the mummy itself became the focus of the depiction instead of the anthropoid coffin, as previously occurred. So despite the huge complexity achieved by coffin decoration, the object itself became somehow invisible, or perhaps better said, transparent, giving full visibility to the mummy. The divine flesh of the mummy thus became the nucleus of a complex network of representations revolving around the body and its immediate containers. The sacredness of the corpse increased, and this is seen with the practice introduced in the 21st dynasty of packing the organs inside the mummy itself and not in the canopic vases. Cosmic integration, one of the magic roles performed by the canopic chest, was thus achieved within the mummy itself, which became the very embodiment of the duat. The yellow background of the coffin walls manifests the solarization of this process, of this corpse, a phenomenon widely depicted on its walls, suggesting the gleaming skin of an awakened god, where, like in a screen, the most important cosmic events are imprinted. In this background of light, several layers of symbols are added, some of amuletic significance, others with ritual meaning featuring the deceased in ritual interaction with the gods of the underworld. All these symbolic layers create magical spheres irradiating from the body of the deceased and leading it towards the transformations granted by the funerary rituals until his full manifestation of a justified God. Coffin decoration does wrap the mummy with semiotic layers of signs. In this process, the corpse is the core of this magical assemblage, and coffin decoration was designed to project the resurrected corpse to the outer layers. This transparency blurred the definition of the coffins themselves to give full visibility to the illumination of the deceased and to his blessed existence in the hereafter as an Osirian god. So, as I said, I would avoid to jump into further conclusions while the study on the decoration of the case is not complete. So this is for the moment what I could share with you, and as interpretations, as suggestions of readings, and of course with only half of it, it's not possible to make definitive statements. But anyway, I think that with this semiotic approach, important clues can be revealed to have a new understanding of the complexity of these objects. So we are facing in the holotype a whole new phenomenon in terms of the understanding of the coffin, and this is very challenging also for us in terms of our own paradigms and methods. And the most important, what I found more challenging in this work was to adopt methods and concepts in which these signs could be interpreted in a way that it allows the dialogue with other documental corpus, such as those from tomb decoration or papyri. And all of that reminds that we are dealing here with a visual culture. And even after this method is achieved to the study of the cases, a very important step has to be carried out further on, and it's related with the sociological meaning of this semiotic system. This semiotic system was so important and so complex that it clearly performed an important role in this society of scholars, of Theban scholars, that use them clearly in a way to define their social role in a society which, surprisingly, considering the situation of deep change from ethnic, sociological, and historical point of view, and political, apparently the use of these objects had an important impact in gathering these communities, and this is another important field of research that we should explore. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your lecture, bringing us to the complexity of the lead of the yellow coffins. And I have just quick questions, because before I give the microphone to whoever wants to ask a question, and it concerns, of course, in trying to understand the complexity of the decoration and the iconography of the lead. Very convincingly so, you used a characterization that Dr. von Walsum already pointed out of the architectonization of the lead. You showed us how to go in from the basic to the more complex scheme. Also there is an evolution, how the relationship between the decoration and the development of the tombs, and especially also the royal tomb, can be seen, and how, of course, the solar Osirian unity is very important. But then my question is concerning some of the last comments you made on the mummies, and how, well, the coffins becomes more transparent, and you also added on the sacredness of the mummy. And I would like to point out something that Kara had already published about how, anyway, in the development on the 21st dynasty, where from a political, economic, sociological point of view, in observing that the coffins were dismissed and reused and recycled, then it became necessary to I don't know how you say, to make the mummy to become also more like a coffin, as it were. So if you have a first layer where you translate the decoration of the tomb into the coffin, then you want to reassure anyway that the mummy itself has all it needs in case the coffin is put aside, is reused, is recycled, and some of the things that we are observing in our coffin, and something that is very interesting to be still about, is how the warnish and the decoration goes through the edge of the case over to the coffin, and when it was made, in order to understand what was happening during the mouth opening ritual, whether we still see a coffin, yes, or we do see a mouth.
Well, it is a quite open question. So if I could understand, the question is how this relates with reuse. This is I should avoid to answer that. Not only because I have an expert of reuse here in this room, but also because this points out towards a totally different level, a totally different plan, the plan of the social value of the object. And this could be quite changeable. And it is unclear for me at this moment to know if when the craftsmen were working on this on the workshop, if it was a phenomenon real for them that these objects would be certainly reused. It could be a possibility that they worked with this assumption. But it is very difficult to know that at this moment. What we do know, it's from the later 21st dynasty, the process of reuse was very was evolving workshops in a very in a variety of goals, and sometimes it had a deep effect on the production of the craftsmen, because, for instance, it is clear that recycling, I call it, every object can be reused and not changed, as Cara pointed out several times. So I used in this particular word for recycling when the object goes again to the workshop and is recycled. It is a fact that many of these objects are recycled according to the new schemes of decoration. But then when it starts happening, this phenomenon, workshops that create new objects goes back in recovering the older layouts, the old-fashioned layouts, in a new way. We clearly understand that it's a later momentum, but it's according to this old-fashioned layout, in order to distinguish themselves from the new trend, the new trendy situation, which is getting more and more complex, the decoration with several registers and adding into that. So the elite burials, as Cara establishes, these differences between this typology between coffins according to the quality of the craftsmanship. The elite burials at this moment starts to renovating the older layouts, starts to recover the basic scheme. So it is really a question which can can lead us to interpret more information, but to which it's, at least for me, it's not possible to answer with an hypothesis, even with an hypothesis. It is possible that the workshops were creating these objects knowing that they would serve a variety of individuals, and this is very likely in the end of the dynasty, because they are just standardized. They are unique, but they are highly standardized, and the individual is blurred completely, and he can, in some of these cases, he totally disappears. So it is with the programs like these, it is clear that these objects like these are not created for a particular, are not created under commission. This is, for me, is more safe than to have a broader understanding. So clearly they are not crafted under commission of an individual, but this is very important. They are created and they are crafted under the command of a corporation, which is the corporation of Amun. So it is the corporation of Amun which manage the creation in the workshops and creates these rules, these settings. It's like a very sophisticated program with the layout very well established. Each section is ruled by these particular key features, and clearly a craftsman knows what to do, regardless of working in a fine context or a very bad and poor context. They all know what it is expected from the formal point of view. And this, to my point of view, reveals that for the corporation of Amun, I use it in quotes, the production of these objects was meant to have a social role in the community as a whole, and not strictly for one individual or the other. But it's a fact that the number of coffins produced by the late of the dynasty is increasingly higher. So it is expected. I think this can lead us to think that the system of achieving a funerary equipment was becoming more democratized, and they are just as poor as they are. They meant a lot in terms of social value of the object.
So, thank you, Rogerio, for your very interesting paper. Why do you think the 19th dynasty coffins, the Ramessid coffins, can't fit into this schema of light? Because it could work.
Yeah, sure.
It could work. You have the black on the inside, the gold on the outside. So,
I said that one should not forget the continuum between. One should not forget the continuum between the older models and the yellow type. This continuum exists. Yellow types are not created out of nothing. They grow in a continuum. They grow from the proto-yellow coffins. They grow from there. What I think is that from the formal point of view, so this idea that you put forward, of course, it is detected there, already there. It is detected on the black coffins themselves, from there, sure. Yeah. Yes. 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 Exactly. Yeah. So this is detected previously. That's why I use this title, Gilded Flesh, and I put the face that I used is the black one. So, from this point of view, there is a continuum. But from the formal point of view, when you build a system when you build a typology, you have to you work with key features, not just any feature. You have to understand the role of a particular feature in the organization of the object as an idea. The challenge when we do that is to keep away from what we think it is a category. It's a very difficult process, which worked very well in natural sciences, because in natural science you study organisms, and here you have an organic evolution of craftsmanship in the same way. And when you put a living being into one particular shelf, if you look at the categories that are used, they are based on key features that are even difficult to grasp. It's a cotyledonia or something like this. Sometimes it's just the way the route is organized or something like that. But how botanists established a category is not by just a random shape. It's just organizing the systematic evolution of the body of the beings, of the living beings. And we understand that this feature in particular plays an important role in this process. Sometimes it's a very discrete feature. So when you make this kind of work in archaeological objects, and you have the chance, as we do, of working with an outstanding number of objects, you can seriate them. And then you see that the challenge is not to project our ideas, but to see from the material evidence if the Egyptians, in fact, considered these objects as a different category from the others. And I only see that after one particular moment, when the mummy cover is created. So when the mummy cover is created, it is created with a new organization and with a new layout. And it's a very stable, despite all the evolution. It's a very stable layout. And from then on, the evolution is based on this particular scheme. And what we see in the proto-yellow type, as I call, is a very interesting and exciting moment of experimentation. What we see, it's every single object is different, not because of a detail, but because of all the organization of the coffin. It's a new experiment. So it is difficult to in these objects, some of them are undecorated lids, some of them present the deities centripetally oriented, some of them present the deities transversally oriented. So there is a variety of possibilities that reveals that each coffin is it's a medium to experiment a new vision of the afterlife. This vision is common with yellow coffins. It's a festive vision of the afterlife. That means that there is implicit, there is a celebration of the afterlife as an eternal relation with gods, with the sacred sphere. So, and this empowers the deceased. You don't see it previously. So, but there is this continuum. But from the formal point of view, when the mummy cover is created, then you witness to the creation of a particular layout. And this seems to have been real for the Egyptians. I really don't care about, it's not my purpose to create a typology that works for me. This is not the case. What I had in mind is to understand, if it existed, the layout of this object as a Theban craftsman looked at it. And it is this work of reconstruction that I tried to establish.
My question is, did you find any difference between the decoration for lid or coffins for ladies and coffins for men?
This is a very interesting, question. Thank you. It's difficult to say. It's difficult to say. Of course, there are formal differences. Just for the first time, indeed, these objects dating from the Ramesside period, began to be gender defined. Previously, they didn't. And of course, in the upper section, this is very clear. The gender definition of the deceased. As for the rest, it is extremely difficult, and I still didn't go into these kind of studies, but I would like to. But until the moment, I can't see a sharp contrast between man and woman, and this is actually very interesting. On itself, it is very interesting. Yeah. 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 Yeah, sure, there are a lot of differences. It's exactly what I pointed out, but those differences are blurred when we contrast the coffin of his wife with his son. And his son is the coffin of his son is more alike with the coffin of his mother. And for me, this difference is just given to the moment of when the coffin was produced. And what I think is very special in the tomb of Sennacherib is that you clearly see this moment when a download has been carried out between the decoration of the tomb, which is outstanding, and the decoration of the lid. And in the coffin of Sennacherib, you see it happening, starting the first moment of this download, so to speak. The images of the deceased as a living, which are really what really defines the yellow type. And the proto-yellow type is the way that craftsmen explore this novelty, how the resources that are provided by this new horizon, we can introduce the deceased into the decorative scheme of the coffin. Wow, this is a major breakthrough. So what can we do with this resource? And the proto-yellow type it reveals us how this worked. And this worked quite fast. And what we see in the tomb of Sennacherib is how fast it happened, from Sennacherib to his wife and his son, and from then on. Yeah. So yeah, it's yeah, that's it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have maybe a question. I'm not sure. Okay, in the past years, there is a tendency in many fields of study to create what we call mathematical or computational model to understand motif or decorations of subject of study. Okay, for example, it's happening in botany, it's happening in zoology. Okay, for example, they created a mathematical equation so that they can simulate the pattern of the shell of some sea mollusk, or maybe the spots or the stripes of some big cats, so using computational model. Okay, of course we need reliable variables for that. In this case, maybe one of the variables may be the dynastic time, another variables may be the social status of the deceased, and another variables may be the surrounding decoration. Maybe that will lead to this kind of idea. Okay, we have a blank coffin. And when you have this kind of equations, you put these variables, and you can simulate the pattern or the motif on that coffin. I'm not sure whether there is any tendency in this particular field, just like in zoology and botany.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for a suggestion. I think it's perfectly we should include more. How you say? We should create more multidisciplinary teams. We should build this kind of teams. And of course, computer sciences can add a lot in the reading, in the processing of these materials, as they are really very highly, densely decorated. I adopted a different approach besides the conceptual framework of the conceptual tools. I found useful for me to go into the process of creation. Another scholar before me pointed out to the importance of this process here, which was a very dear colleague of us, Jonathan Elias, and he also pointed out for the importance of the process itself. So drawing these compositions makes your hand teach the eye. The way you understand and see the compositions is gradually shaped by the way you go into every single line. And this is for me, because I don't have this background in computer science, was far more important than just having a computerized version of these compositions. So I also, although it is important to have this kind of tools, I also think that it's very important that we keep a closer contact with not only the objects, but with the process of creation itself, in order to make us clear the way they are built and they relate with each other. So both things, I think, are very important to integrate.
Well, Rogerio, thank you so much again. And thank you all for coming. And I would like to remind you that the following lecture will be at the beginning of October and delivered by Professor Dr. Seifried, the 2nd of October, 3rd of October. Thank you, Susan, for reminding me. So, Professor Dr. Seifried, Director of Neues Museum in Berlin. So, thank you very much and have a good night.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was thinking that